Hey students, this is a tutorial on how to create a Softgoods rendering. This is a line drawing that I created in Photoshop. You could very easily create something like this on paper, or if you wanted to, you could draw it in Illustrator. There's a way to export drawings from SolidWorks as well, so either whatever method you want to use will work so long as you get a nice clean line drawing. Because what you want to do is you want to have these clean lines so that you can use the magic wand tool. So that's what I'm using right here. I'm using the magic wand tool to select areas. So I'm selecting this, and the red mask that you're seeing, that's called the quick mask. You can find that by hitting Q. It will show you what you are selecting presently. Anything that is in red, you are not selecting. Anything that is transparent, that's going to be what you are selecting. Now you don't need to see all this, so I'm going to fast forward. Now what I'm doing here is I notice that the selection is not big enough, so I'm going to select, modify, expand. And I'm going to expand the selection by 2 pixels. What this does is that it expands the selection so that it overlaps the line art a little bit. That way it's a lot easier when I fill it with solid color. Now you want to go down here to create a new fill or adjustment layer, then go up to select solid color. When you select solid color, you can choose your color. I'm going to go with a cool gray. Now you'll notice in the layers panel to your right, there's a blue box, that's your color, and then to the right of that, that is a mask. That black and white box effectively masks the blue color so that only some of it's going to get through. It's going to be in the shape of the selection that we had earlier. Selecting the layer mask, you can use the brush tool and a black fill to paint and hide things from that layer. You can also use the white fill to reveal things. It's kind of like a non-permanent way to erase something from a layer because you can always use the opposite color to erase it back in. You can use the X key to switch back and forth between painting with white and painting with black. Now I'm going to use the magic wand tool. I'm going to make sure that sample all layers is not selected. Sometimes that can mess stuff up. And then if you want to add to the selection, you can just hold down the shift and you'll see a little plus sign next to your magic wand tool, and that will add to the current selection. And everything else you've seen before, so I'm just going to fast forward this part. Now I'm using the magic wand tool to select the side pocket. This is going to end up changing in the final design, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. And then I don't know why I selected that color for the strap, but what I decided to do is go to the internet to research some wool and leather cases to see what color schemes and material patterns are going to work for this kind of product. So I'm going to fast forward through this part because it's not terribly interesting. It's a lot of just selecting, using the magic wand tool, select spaces, using a solid color fill to create these new colors. Now here I'm creating a brass color. I'm going with kind of a more faded yellow. I will go back and add some reflection later on. So right now I'm really just going for the base color for each of these things. I'm going to be researching and looking for some material textures that I can use in this file later, but right now all I need is the base colors. And here I'm going back and renaming the layers so that I don't get confused. It's a good discipline to name your layers. I often don't, but especially for the sake of this video, I want to make sure that I have the layers named. Now with all the layers named, I'm going to start researching some wool backpacks because I want to see what the straps look like. I'm not finding anything immediately. I found some interesting stuff, but what I realized is that I wanted to research wool messenger bags because those are going to have some more relevant patterns and straps. I'm seeing some stuff I like. This one was particularly interesting, so I decided to copy this image and paste it into the file right there, and I'm going to use that as a reference. What I'm noticing is that the messenger bag has one of those little clasps to adjust how long the strap is, and I don't have that drawn in. So what I decided to do is, in addition to drawing that clasp in, I also decided to draw in some leather material on the base of this bag. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to fast forward through this part because it's not terribly interesting. If you want to, you can slow it down, I suppose, and see me draw, but I don't think you're necessarily going to learn anything from this. All right, so with that drawn, I then decided to change the design of the bag on the bottom, and that's long and boring, so I just cut that out. We're going to skip ahead to the final result. All right, so this is the design that I went with. I erased the center line that went down the middle of the bag, the front of the bag, and I also added some leather to the bottom, just like that bag here. Now I'm going to start looking for textures. You'll notice here that I found some textures, but not all of them were large enough. So I'm going to go up to Tools, and I'm going to select Size, Large, and that's going to refine my search results so that I only look for large textures. These textures I'm going to copy and paste into the Photoshop file. There are other ways you can do this. You could save the file and then import them into Photoshop as a smart object. That's probably a more responsible way of handling your materials and textures, but this is the way that I'm doing it. All right, this is important, so I'm going to slow this down a bit. I'm getting the material into position. Then I'm going to put it above the layer that I want it to reference, and then I'm going to hover between the two layers, and I'm going to hold down Alt and click. You see the icon is going to change. What that does is that effectively uses the bottom layer as a mask for the top layer. So now anything that is in the top layer is restricted by the pixels in the layer below it. And you can see what that looks like. Now with this in place, I'm going to go through the layer styles. Multiply and screen are two that are great to try off the bat. Overlay is also a great one to try. None of those are really working, even though overlay looked kind of cool. I'm going to go with soft light. Now what I want to do is I want to create a mask on this material layer itself. The mask is just like that mask earlier. I can paint using black and white. I'm going to paint with a soft brush so that I can get kind of a faded result, and because that's going to need to fade into the material that I have over here. When you're transforming, if you hold down Command when you click on the corner of the bounding box, you can skew it. Now I'm going to create another layer mask over here, and I'm going to soften that off so that it gets pretty close to seamless. Now this is something new. This is something important. When you're transforming, you can also right-click on the transformation box and you can go to Warp. Warp will give you this grid that you can then transform. So I'm transforming the material and warping it so that it looks a little bit more like that flap has kind of a wave to it. Understanding transform, understanding skewing, and understanding warping. The strap is not, there's nothing new with the strap, so I'm just going to speed this up a little. Now it's time to add the wool texture. I'm going to jump ahead to when I understood that I needed the wool felt texture. And I'm going to find one that works. This one works great. So I'm going to view image. That is a lot of texture right there. So I'm going to copy the image and paste it directly into my file. Again, I could save that as a smart object, but this is just the way that I roll. Again, move it above the layer that you want it to be masked by. And then hold down the Alt button between the two layers. And it will be, and click, and it'll be masked by the layer below it. I'm going to skew it using the Command button and the transform feature. Again, I'm going to transform and warp this a little bit so that the material looks like it's bending around. I want the material to look like it's collapsing a little bit as it rolls away from us, so that's why I am transforming it this way. Now with this flap, I'm going to slow this down because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. You can see that I'm treating these as two different planes, and as I transform this, it's going to disappear briefly because Photoshop literally can't process. But as you zoom in, you can see that on the top, the material really collapses. Like those details are really compressed. But on the front, you can get a lot more detail. So that's what I wanted to do. Now I'm going to use a layer mask to soften the transition a little bit, and then I'm going to use layer style. I'm going to do this one more time for the interior. It's not super important that I get the perspective right on this, but just for the sake of consistency. And then I'm going to group the materials and the solid colors so that my layer panel looks a little cleaner. Now what I'm doing here is I want to change the color of the line work, so I'm going to click on this button, which is Lock Transparent Pixels. This means that if there is a pixel that is fully transparent, that it will stay fully transparent. If there's a pixel that is fully opaque, it will remain fully opaque, and anything in between will remain just as it is. However, you can change it to whatever color you want. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and paint over the lines. You can see that I'm not terribly careful right now because I don't need to be, because I can't paint over anything that doesn't already have pixels in that layer. Now flipping back and forth between the two, I can kind of get an idea of which one works and which one doesn't. I think I stuck with the colored lines for a while, even though in the end I went with the black lines. And here I'm renaming the groups so that, again, I can keep my layers panel clean and I know where I need to look if I need to adjust anything. So with this is not a bad Softgoods project. If you wanted to stop right here, you certainly could, but I'm going to show you how to add a little bit more depth. Now what I'm doing is I'm creating a new layer within the groups that is also masked by the, well, it's not masked yet, but it will be. I'm going to use a large brush with soft edges to paint in some shadows. I'm going to hit the bottom and I'm going to hit the edge. This will make a lot more sense once I mask it. I mask it, it's in the wrong order, so I rearrange it, mask it again, and there you can see there's a lot more depth on that main body panel. And I want to add a little bit more shadow right there because I want that to pop. So now I want to add a little bit more white. What I noticed though is that the pen pressure is still dictating how broad the brush is. I don't want that, so I'm going to go in my brush settings, turn that off. So now the brush is going to be the same width no matter what. And I'm going to speed this part up because it's not terribly interesting. Here I'm going to create an overall gradient so that it's slightly lighter on the left and darker on the right. On the top I'm going to make that brighter, and then I'm going to try and get a highlight right on this edge so that it really looks like it bends right there, and again a subtle gradient from left to right. I'm going to bring back some shadows on the edges of the flap. Now I like this, but the blacks are a little too dark for me, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the output level so that the output level for the black is more of a 70% gray, so that what was black before is now considerably lighter. So you can see when I click preview it changes a little bit, and now it's nicer, it's more subtle. But even with that I want a little bit more, so I'm going to push a little bit more shadow under this edge to get that to pop. And I'm liking the way that looks. So now I want to create some shadows from the interior, and I'm going to create some shadows for this side pocket here, treating this like a cylinder. And then I'm going to speed up the rest of this because I'm really just creating highlights and shadows on the rest of these materials. Now with the wool I'm using black and white to paint, and it's just fine because the wool it's practically a gray color. But you'll notice when I switch to painting the shadows and the highlights on the brown, I'm going to want to select a different color. So here I'm selecting a darker gray so that I'm painting with a darker gray, and I'm not painting black on the leather because that would have just looked dirty. And when I try to paint with white, white doesn't look right, so I sample the color and then I select a brighter, a slightly lighter brown. That way I can use these two colors to create realistic highlights and shadows. Now here, this is where I decided to go back to the black lines because it got really confusing down here. And here I'm just creating some highlights and shadows to create some depth on those materials right there. I'm liking the way this is looking so far. And now I'm going to select in the different group, I'm going to paint, create a new layer over top and paint on some highlights and shadows for the layer material down here. Going to get a nice soft shadow to really communicate that the front corner is kind of rounded. And now here I wanted a straight line, so I didn't use the Wacom. Instead I used the trackpad, or when you're using a mouse, you click on the top, and before you release you hold shift. When you click again and release, it's going to create one solid line. So I do that twice to create nice clean straight lines. That's a good trick if you want to get a straight line using the brush. Now I'm going to create some highlights and shadows on the strap real quick. Now for this brass texture. This is a easy way to make something look reflective. All you have to do is get a solid color so that it's essentially white on top and then erase out. Look how shiny that looks. And I'm going to speed through adding some texture to the rest of the brass. All right, now again, this is probably good enough. If you wanted to stop here and put it in a portfolio format, I think that'd be perfectly fine, but I want to do a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a shadow, and then I'm going to try that background that I saw on the YouTube video that I showed earlier in class. So I'm basically selecting the same shape, moving it down, going to blur. I should go to Gaussian blur. And here you can select how blurry you want to make this. I'm going to go with that right there. I like it. And then I'm going to adjust the color. I want it to be darker. Don't want it to be so brown. I'm going to transform the size so that it doesn't look like it's floating off the edge. And I like it. Now, to create this background, I modified a brush. I didn't need to. I literally could have just used a round brush because it's going to be cropped anyway. But in my brush presets, I modified the brush so that it was skinny like this. So I could create lines like this. Again, I'm using the click-shift-click trick to create some straight lines. I realized that I'm painting with brown instead of black, so I use the transparency lock again and use the paint bucket tool and black to paint those black. And I'm going to duplicate them, transform them, get them to overlap, adjust them a little bit, skew them so that it doesn't look like they're perfectly the same. Create another layer. Okay, it's looking all right. Now what I want to do is I want to use the marquee tool to select a box. I'm going to go down here, I'm going to select gradient. I want the gradient to go from black to white. So I'm going to select white, and I'm going to raise the opacity. And then I'm going to move that below the 3 layers I just created and have them all masked by that. Okay, now that looks pretty cool, but those lines are very dark. So I'm going to invert them. I'm going to see what it looks like when I invert them. I'm not crazy about the way that looks, so I'm going to adjust the opacity for all these. I have made a few more revisions. I'm going to fast forward through those. And that's what it was going to look like. So that's how I would create something. Now I'm sure there are 100 different ways to do this because Photoshop is so powerful, but this is the way that I've learned and this is the way that I do it. If you know some ways that would make this easier, feel free to tell me. I'd love to be able to share it. But this is the way that I do Softgoods renderings. So I hope you've learned something. I hope you're encouraged and inspired. I hope that you feel like you can do this because I believe that you can. So what I want you to do is I want you to try it for yourself now. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You know where to find me. And I'm looking forward to some fantastic renderings from each and every one of you. Thank you so much.